You know, your book, Case for Christ, was something that meant so much to me as a new believer.
That's awesome.
Because I came out of atheism myself, just as you did. And today I refer to myself as a recovering atheist.
Right. I like that.
I even have a shirt that says recovering atheist. And it's not easy to recover from the belief that God does not exist. What gave you the conviction early on in your life that there was no God?
Well, I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving, all-knowing creator of the universe was just kind of absurd on the surface of it. I thought the idea that God created people was probably not true, but that people created God because they're afraid of death. So they made up this idea of a supernatural being and an afterlife to make themselves feel better about dying. That's what I thought. Now, I tend to be a skeptic because that's my background, journalism and law. And so I think that fed into it as well.
Yeah, me too. And that was my thought as a young man. My father was a school teacher. My grandparents were school teachers. I loved history. I loved math. I loved science. And so I wanted facts. I wanted evidence. And so the idea of a God seemed to me, like you said, was a crutch for allegedly weak people who couldn't answer big questions, and it made them feel better.
Exactly right. And so I took kind of 3 steps into atheism. First step was when I was in middle school. I started asking those embarrassing questions like, why would a loving God allow pain and suffering? You know, why would God send people to hell? And nobody wanted to talk about it. So I thought, oh, I get it. They don't want to talk about it because there's no good answers. Then I got into high school. Then I learned that Darwinism explains the origin and diversity of life, so God's out of a job. Then I went to the University of Missouri and I took a course on the historical Jesus from an atheist. And he taught me you can't trust what the New Testament tells you about Jesus. So those are kind of my 3 steps that cemented me into my atheism.
So you matured and were well rooted in your atheism. And professionally, you're a journalist, and so you are trained to ask questions, to dig deeper and not just believe what you're told on the surface. What caused you to go so deeply into investigating with skeptical questions Christianity?
My wife was an agnostic. She didn't know what to believe about God, and she met a woman who was a nurse and a Christian. They became best friends. Leslie, my wife, asked questions, went to church with her, and then she gave me the worst news that an atheist husband could get. She said, I've decided to become a follower of Jesus. And I thought, oh no. The first word that went through my mind was a divorce. I was going to walk out. But then I thought, you know, what if I could rescue her from this cult? You know, if I could just disprove the resurrection of Jesus, then I could pull the rug out from under this whole thing and get my wife back and get our old life back. And so that's what prompted me to take my journalism training and my legal training. And I ended up spending 2 years of my life systematically investigating what is the historical evidence for Jesus.
Or lack of it.
Or lack of it, and his resurrection.
Was one of your concerns also when your wife came to you and said, now I'm a follower of Jesus, that this was going to just cause all of the fun in your marriage and your life to evaporate?
Exactly.
Like she's going to be this holy religious person now? No, and all of a sudden, there's no more fun weekends?
Yeah, I mean, I was a hedonist because I figured if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, the most logical way for me to live my life would be as someone who just pursued pleasure. And so I was living a very immoral life, drunken, profane, narcissistic, self-absorbed. I mean, that was my life. And it affected our family. I remember my daughter, when she was little, you know, a toddler, if she was playing with some toys and she heard me come home from work through the front door, she would just gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. Is she going to be drunk again? You know, she's going to be yelling and screaming. And so this affected our entire family. And when my wife came to faith, I began to see positive things in her values, in her character and so forth, the way she related to me and the children. And it was like looking into a mirror, and it accentuated my sin. It made me feel less than because I'm watching her and she's kind of growing in this kind of positive way. And I think, what about me? You know, what does this mean for me? Is she going to judge me? Is she going to look down on me?
Sometimes I've seen people have a spouse or a close friend come to faith, and all of a sudden there's this anger that wells up inside, almost like, like you said, are you going to judge me? Oh, you're too good for me? Are we not? You're going to places I can't go, and I'm going to be left out. This is going to change our relationship.
Exactly. I thought this was going to be the end of our marriage. And so I spent, as I said, 2 years checking this stuff out, because even I, as an atheist, recognize that the resurrection is the bedrock of Christianity. You know, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins.
Now, when you were living in this sea of hedonism, were you enjoying that?
I loved it.
You loved it. So even though you're drunk, even though your daughter doesn't want to see you and she'd rather play with her toys, even though your wife is looking at you saying, I found something so much better, you're still loving this? Or are you sensing that she actually has discovered something that I need?
Well, as she grew in her faith, and I began to see the positive impact on her values, her character, the way she related to me and the children, then I began to feel this conviction that maybe what the lifestyle I was living maybe wasn't the optimum way to live. And maybe getting drunk on the weekend, maybe I could even find a different kind of hobby that was a little more constructive and so forth. So it is true that as she grew in her devotion to Christ, it was accentuating to me my, the depth of my depravity. And I didn't want to face that. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to paper it over. I wanted to pretend I was a great guy.
But there's two ways to go there. You can either say, my wife is into something that is a fairy tale and at worst case could be dangerous. You know, maybe a mental illness. She's believing in things that are not true. She's hallucinating. But there's also the chance that what she believes is maybe true. I mean, for thousands of years, Christians have believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So you decided to take your investigative skills and go for the jugular of Christianity.
Yeah, because I was a journalist at the Chicago Tribune. I'd seen plenty of dead bodies, and I've never seen a dead body come back to life after 3 days. So I figured, come on, give me a long weekend, and I can disprove the resurrection of Jesus. It just doesn't happen, because I was a materialist. In other words, someone who just believed all there is that what we touch and see. And there is no supernatural, there is no God, and consequently, dead bodies do not return to life. I honestly thought I could disprove it in a weekend.
Now, were you settled, when you look back, were you settled on that? Or were you wanting for Christianity to be false so that you could continue in your hedonism? Or there's another option, were you secretly hoping that maybe there was a God out there that gave meaning and purpose and direction to your life?
There was a push and a pull. In other words, I was being gently pulled toward Christianity because I could see my wife and these positive
good
changes,
things that were happening.
Good things that were happening.
But it was like pie in the sky, too good to be true, fairy tale.
And then the other side was, wait a minute, I want the old Leslie back. I want her old life back. I didn't sign up for this. This wasn't the deal. I want the old life back. And so there was a push and there was a pull at the same time. So I figured I'm going to be like an umpire in a baseball game. I'm going to call a ball and a strike. I'm going to investigate the evidence as honestly as I can, and I'm going to evaluate it, and in the end, I'm going to reach a verdict based on the evidence I uncover.
This is kind of a tall order, because what you were attempting to do is to prove that something that allegedly happened, the resurrection of Christ, thousands of years ago, actually never occurred. How do you find evidence of something that doesn't exist?
Well, there are techniques you can use to investigate any ancient writing. So whether it's Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius, you can take these same investigative techniques and apply them to the pages of the New Testament to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? So there are a lot of historical guides that you can use to try to diagnose whether or not the writer of the Gospels, for instance, is being honest when they report what they're reporting. I'll give you an example. There's a criterion called the criterion of embarrassment. What that means is, if you're reading an ancient writing and the author is saying something that hurts their own case or is embarrassing to themselves, they're probably telling the truth. Because if they're going to make it up, they wouldn't make up something that was going to hurt their own case or embarrass themselves. And so I read the Gospels, and guess who discovers the empty tomb of Jesus? Women. Well, wait a minute. In first century Jewish and Roman culture, women were not considered to be reliable purveyors of information. They generally weren't allowed to testify in a court of law. They weren't considered to be credible. And so it was embarrassing in the first century to say that a woman discovered the tomb empty. If you're going to make it up, you would have said John discovered the tomb empty, Peter discovered the tomb empty. That would have given it extra credibility. So why do the Gospels say that women discover the tomb empty when it hurts their case? And in fact, in the 2nd century, there were opponents of Christianity who criticized it by saying, oh, you can't trust that. Women discover the tomb empty. So why did they say that? The conclusion is they're telling the truth. That's what happened, and they're reporting it because they're letting the chips fall where they may.
That's fascinating because as a guy who appreciates science and the scientific method, I had to discover what you're saying, which is that historical events have to be proven or disproven differently than, say, the law of gravity.
Right.
I can't prove that Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address or was the 16th president of the United States in the same way that I prove the law of inertia.
Right.
I have to use different criteria.
Exactly.
And it's still scientific, but it's a different discipline, and you're actually an expert at that kind of thing.
I mean, it is. It's a different discipline, but it's equally credible and reliable. So in other words, you look at things like this document. How long was it written after the events that it's reporting on? Is it immediate or is it 200 years later? Because you can have legend grow up in the interim and color what's been eventually written down. Are these eyewitnesses? Or are these people who weren't in a position to actually see what they're reporting on? How many people are reporting on something? So there's all these things you can look at to try to say, are these ancient writings telling me what really occurred?
And while that doesn't give us an airtight case that we might like to have, say with the law of gravity or something like that, I find it fascinating that the only way we can believe any ancient documents as trustworthy and reliable is by using this set of standards.
Right.
And if we're going to believe ancient documents like the Iliad, the Odyssey, these things that nobody questions in terms of their authorship, their authenticity, then those same standards should be applied to the Bible.
Exactly right. For instance, most of what we believe is true about the ancient world, most of those facts are based on one source or maybe two sources. And yet, for example, we have 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. That's an avalanche of historical data. Historians drool over this kind of stuff. So we have, when you use the tests that you would use for any other ancient document, don't do anything special because it's religious issues. Let's just use the same investigative techniques.
That's right.
And when you do, you'll walk away convinced, wait a minute, this is what really happened.
Lee, you set out to disprove the resurrection.
Right.
Because if the resurrection is false, that's the king claim of Christianity, is that a man rose from the grave.
Yeah, because anybody can claim to be, you could claim to be God, I could claim to be God. And Jesus got up before a group and he says, I and the Father are one. And the word in Greek there for one is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature, we're one in essence. And the audience understood who he was saying because they said, you're just a man, you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? Anybody can do that. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth, right?
And not only that, I've read in your books like The Case for Christ and others that it wasn't just the biographies of Jesus written by his disciples and those inside the Bible, but accounts of Jesus' life written by those outside the Bible who were not fans of Christianity. There
are actually 110 facts about the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus in ancient sources outside the Bible, documented by the historian Dr. Gary Habermas in his book, The Verdict of History. And so he goes through all these are references to Jesus in documents that are not part of what we would consider to be Holy Scripture.
Lee, much of the evidence about the claims of Jesus, including his resurrection, comes from accounts within the Bible itself.
Right.
So those writers of the Bible are biased, aren't they?
Good question. For me, when I investigated as a skeptic, as an atheist, the ancient evidence for Jesus and his resurrection, I did not give the Bible any special credence. I didn't consider it to be inerrant, inspired, the Word of God. I do now, but I was a skeptic then. But I had to accept the pages of the New Testament for what it undeniably is, which is a set of ancient historical writings. And just as you can investigate any ancient writing, you can take those same investigative techniques and apply them to those pages to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? Now, the question of whether or not the authors are biased, well, anybody who reaches a conclusion based on their experience and what they see and what they know to be true is going to have a point of view. And but we can look at sources that go beyond the Bible, and we can see confirmation of many of the key and salient points about the life teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
And the story of Saul of Tarsus, going from a Pharisee who was persecuting and killing Christians, rounding them up and exterminating them, why in the world would he reverse course and now become one of the most important followers of Christ and write 2/3 of the New Testament? What was in it for him if that wasn't true?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you remove the resurrection, there's no motivation that makes sense to turn Saul of Tarsus into Paul the Apostle.
You can't find a good motive.
Exactly. Makes no sense.
What about this, Lee? Some would say that the accounts of Jesus written in the Bible were written decades after those events occurred. So you're talking 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, these guys are writing about what Jesus said and what Jesus did. Is that too much time to go by? I mean, I have a hard time remembering what my wife told me to get at the grocery store last night. If you're talking 10 years or 20 years from now, could they have misremembered the stuff that happened?
That's a good question. J. Warner Wallace, who you may know, is a cold case homicide investigator who was an atheist and became a Christian because he investigated the evidence. And one of the things he told me, he said, Lee, what did you do last August 12th? I have no idea what I did last August 12th. What did you do on August 12th, 1982? I have no idea what I did on August 12th, 1982. What did you do on August 12th, 1972? Oh, I can tell you the whole thing. I can go through the whole day because that's the day I got married. And so when something amazing happens to you, life-changing, like a resurrection, like someone walking on water, like someone turning water into wine, when you experience something extraordinary, you remember that. And so that would be true of the disciples. Now, keep in mind that they wrote the New Testament, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, within a generation. And A.N. Sherwin White, the famous historian, said that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So this is within the parameters of being reliable, historically speaking. But here's the kicker, and this is what, more than anything else, brought me to faith. We have some information preserved for us that can be dated back so early you cannot write it off as being a legend. Because we know the Apostle Paul was Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. He has this encounter with the risen Jesus. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus, and he meets some apostles. Many people believe this is when he was given a creed, an eyewitness-based creed of the early church that he later sent to the church in Corinth. Other people say it was 3 years later when he went to Jerusalem and he met with 2 eyewitnesses, Peter and James, who were named in this creed as eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, a report about the resurrection was already in existence. The beliefs that make that up go back even earlier. So in other words, we have preserved for us in 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3, a creed, an eyewitness-based creed of the earliest Christians. Right there in the first century, it says that Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared. We can date that creed back to within months of the death of Jesus. One of the great historians, James D.G. Dunn, said, this creed, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed within months of the death of Jesus. So there's no huge time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash, goes right back to the beginning.
There have been claims of other Jewish men identifying as the Messiah.
Yes,
as
several.
The coming of the promised one, the anointed one.
Right. There are people through history who've made the claim that they are the Messiah. Nobody except Jesus, though, fulfills the ancient prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Prophecies that included things like how he would be born of a virgin, his ancestry, how he would die, the time frame in which he would die, things that only he could fulfill. In fact, if Jesus is not the Messiah, there will never be a Messiah, because nobody can go back and fulfill things that needed to be fulfilled before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There were certain prophecies that had to be fulfilled before then. There had to be a return to the temple by the Messiah, and that can't happen today. So if Jesus isn't the Messiah, there never will be a Messiah.